Two mafia families prepared for war at the same time. Weapons were moved, money was pulled together. Old alliances were quietly tested. Each side believed the same thing, that when the shooting started, strength and speed would decide who survived. What neither of them realized was that the outcome had already shifted before a single gun was raised. And the man responsible wasn't choosing who would win. He was choosing who would lose first. At the center of that silent decision was Lucky Luciano. Luciano didn't declare support. He didn't issue orders. He didn't warn either family to stand down. From the outside, he appeared neutral, almost absent. But in the Mafia, neutrality during escalation is never passive. It is observation. It is judgment. And it is how outcomes are shaped without fingerprints. Both families made the same fatal assumption, that preparation bought them time, that as long as they were ready, they still had room to maneuver. What they failed to see was that preparation itself was revealing everything. Fear, impatience, dependence, and weakness, to the one man who didn't need to rush. At some point, Luciano made his choice. Not publicly, not dramatically, a call that wasn't returned, a meeting that never happened, a signal of balance quietly removed. For one family, nothing seemed wrong, until it was. By the time they understood what had changed, they were already positioned as the first to fall. This is the story of how two families prepared for a war they believed would decide everything, and how Lucky Luciano quietly decided which one would lose before the war ever began. Both families entered the standoff believing they were acting rationally. Each had grievances that felt legitimate, slights that had gone unanswered, and recent moves by the other side that looked like preparation for something bigger. In their minds, war wasn't a choice. It was a consequence already set in motion. What they shared, without realizing it, was the same misunderstanding about how power actually worked in that moment. They believed escalation would force clarity, that once both sides showed readiness, the situation would stabilize into negotiations or open conflict. This logic had worked before, in a different era, when strength was measured by numbers and violence settled disputes quickly. But this time, the center of gravity had shifted. The rules were no longer written by the loudest faction, but by the one everyone still needed to acknowledge. That figure was Lucky Luciano. Both families assumed Luciano would eventually step in, to mediate, to restrain, or to align. Each side interpreted his silence in its own favor. One believed neutrality meant quiet support. The other believed it meant delayed intervention. Neither considered the possibility that silence was the evaluation phase, not the pause before action. As preparations intensified, subtle differences emerged. One family moved quickly, consolidating resources and pressing allies for commitments. The other moved more cautiously, trying to keep channels open while still signaling strength. Each interpreted the other's behavior as confirmation of hostile intent. The feedback loop tightened, driven not by facts, but by interpretation. What neither family saw was that they were no longer preparing against each other. They were performing for Luciano. Every move was data. Every rushed decision revealed anxiety. Every attempt to lock in loyalty exposed dependence. Preparation stopped being protection and started becoming evidence. The misunderstanding was simple and fatal. They thought war would decide their fate. In reality, the decision was already being shaped by how they behaved before the first shot. By treating escalation as leverage, they forgot that leverage only works if someone is forced to respond. Luciano wasn't forced, he was watching. And while both families believed they were buying time, they were actually spending it, revealing which of them would be unable to survive the pressure once the balance shifted against them. As both families accelerated their preparations, they believed they were protecting themselves. In reality, they were exposing everything that mattered. Moving toward war is never a neutral act in the Mafia. It reveals how much you fear, how quickly you panic, and how dependent you are on others to survive. And all of that information was visible to Lucky Luciano without him asking a single question. Money was the first signal. One family began pulling cash aggressively, draining reserves that were meant for stability, not crisis. That move suggested urgency, and urgency suggested weakness. The other family was slower, more selective, trying to preserve normal operations while quietly reallocating resources. On the surface, it looked cautious. Under pressure, it looked divided. Then came the alliances. Both sides reached out to the same intermediaries, often within days of each other. The wording was careful, but the intent was clear. Support was being counted before it was needed. That alone told Luciano which family believed it could not stand alone. In a system built on balance, reliance is always a liability. Weapons followed, not in dramatic stockpiles but in subtle shifts, protection reassigned, couriers doubled, routines tightened. These moves were meant to deter the other side. Instead, they confirmed escalation. And escalation, when unprovoked by an actual attack, reads as fear to anyone watching from above. What made this phase decisive was that preparation removes ambiguity. A rumor can be denied. A posture can be misread. But sustained logistical movement tells a story that can't be argued with. Luciano didn't need informants inside both families. Their behavior was the report. One family revealed impatience. They wanted resolution fast, believing speed would force Luciano's hand. The other revealed dependence, trying to preserve appearances while quietly securing permission from too many places. Both approaches carried risk, but only one would collapse once pressure was applied. By preparing for war, the families thought they were leveling the field. What they were really doing was turning themselves into open books. Every move narrowed the range of possible outcomes. Every adjustment reduced flexibility. And somewhere in that process, Luciano no longer needed to choose based on loyalty or history. The choice would be based on who had already shown they couldn't survive a prolonged imbalance. The war hadn't started yet, but the losing side was beginning to take shape. The choice didn't arrive with drama. There was no announcement, no visible shift that anyone could point to and say, "This is when it happened." That was the danger of it. Lucky Luciano didn't choose a side by declaring support. He chose by withdrawing balance. It started with something small. A meeting that had been expected, quietly postponed. A message that was acknowledged but never answered. A familiar intermediary who suddenly stopped returning calls for one family while remaining accessible to the other. In the Mafia, these are not accidents. They are signals, and signals, when repeated, become conclusions. One family noticed the change first and misunderstood it. They assumed Luciano was pressuring them to move faster, to prove commitment, to show strength. Instead of slowing down, they accelerated. They tightened control, demanded clearer loyalty, and pushed allies into decisions they weren't ready to make. Each move confirmed exactly what Luciano needed to see. The other family sensed the shift differently. They interpreted the silence as caution, not rejection. They reduced visibility, delayed commitments, and avoided forcing clarity too early. From the outside, it looked passive. From Luciano's perspective, it looked survivable. What mattered was not intention, but reaction. Luciano wasn't judging who was right. He was judging who would break first once equilibrium was removed. By denying one family reassurance, he forced them into exposure. By leaving the other unprovoked, he preserved their flexibility. The moment the choice became irreversible was when the isolated family acted as if abandonment had already occurred. That behavior, not Luciano's silence, marked them as the first to lose. In trying to compensate for uncertainty, they revealed panic. And panic in organized crime is a structural flaw. Luciano didn't need to sabotage anyone. He simply stopped stabilizing the situation. The system responded exactly as he expected. One side escalated into a position it couldn't sustain. The other waited long enough to let that escalation become proof. By the time the families realized neutrality was gone, it was already uneven. The war they were preparing for was no longer symmetrical. One side had been quietly designated to absorb the first blow, not because they were weaker in numbers, but because they had shown they couldn't endure uncertainty. The choice was never about loyalty, it was about pressure, and Luciano had just decided who would feel it first. Once the balance tipped, the family that had lost Luciano's quiet protection didn't recognize the danger for what it was. They believed they were still in control of the timeline, that moving faster could compensate for uncertainty. In reality, speed only narrowed their options. Every decision they made after that point carried the weight of panic, and panic is visible to anyone who knows how to look. They began tightening internally. Orders became shorter, less negotiable. Longtime lieutenants were pressured for guarantees they couldn't honestly give. That pressure traveled downward fast, creating friction where discipline was supposed to exist. Men stopped improvising. They waited for instructions that arrived too late or contradicted the last ones. Command became noise. At the same time, the family pushed outward. They tried to lock in allies early, framing urgency as loyalty. But urgency reads differently depending on who's watching. To neutral observers, and especially to Lucky Luciano, it looked like overextension. The family was spending political capital before the war had even started, turning potential partners into witnesses of their fear. Every attempt to secure advantage created another vulnerability. Moving weapons faster meant exposing roots. Consolidating money meant revealing strain. Pressuring allies meant showing dependence. The family thought they were closing ranks. What they were actually doing was compressing themselves into a shape that could only break one way. The trap wasn't a setup engineered by Luciano. It was structural. Once he removed equilibrium, the family's own habits did the rest. They mistook activity for control and decisiveness for strength. Meanwhile, their rival didn't have to bait them or provoke escalation. All they had to do was stay patient and let the imbalance deepen. By the time violence finally seemed inevitable, the outcome was already asymmetric. One family was tense, exposed, and internally strained. The other was quieter, better positioned, and still connected. When the first real blows landed, they didn't just land harder. They landed on a target that had already exhausted itself preparing for the wrong fight. The family didn't walk into a trap because someone pushed them. They walked into it because they couldn't stand not knowing where they stood. And Luciano had known that from the moment he stopped answering their calls. When the first acts of violence finally surfaced, they felt almost anticlimactic. Not because they were small, but because the outcome no longer hinged on them. The family that had rushed, tightened, and overexposed itself entered the conflict already compromised. The other side entered intact. And standing outside the line of fire was Lucky Luciano, watching a result that no longer required his involvement. The opening blows landed exactly where pressure had been building the longest. Routes that had been moved in haste were disrupted. Alliances secured through urgency failed to hold under stress. Internal discipline cracked the moment plans met resistance. What looked like aggression was really collapse catching up to momentum. The family that had prepared the hardest discovered that preparation made them predictable. The opposing family didn't need brilliance to win, only patience. They conserved resources while their rival burned them. They let the first side expose itself publicly and privately, then responded selectively. Each response felt measured, legitimate, almost reluctant. That posture mattered. It preserved external support and framed the conflict as containment, not conquest. Luciano never had to intervene to stop the war. He didn't need to. Once the imbalance was revealed, escalation only accelerated the inevitable. Intermediaries drifted away from the losing side, not out of betrayal, but out of survival. Money dried up. Communication thinned. The family that had believed speed would protect them realized too late that speed had isolated them. By the time the fighting slowed, there was nothing left to negotiate. The war ended, not with a decisive victory, but with exhaustion and abandonment. One family remained functional. The other remained visible, a dangerous position in a world that punishes weakness without ceremony. What everyone understood afterward was simple and unsettling. The decisive move hadn't been made on the streets. It had been made earlier, in silence. Luciano hadn't chosen who would win. He had chosen who would be unable to endure the waiting. The war didn't reward strength, it rewarded restraint. And in that equation, the outcome had been settled long before anyone reached for a weapon. When the smoke finally cleared, no one could point to a single moment when the war truly began, or ended. There was no decisive battle, no final order that closed the book. There was only a realization that had arrived too late. One family had been defeated long before the first shot was fired, and the person who made that outcome inevitable never had to step onto the battlefield. That person was Lucky Luciano. Luciano didn't win by choosing sides. He won by choosing when balance would disappear, by withholding reassurance from one family and allowing pressure to build unevenly. He let behavior decide the outcome. Fear did the work. Impatience sealed it. By the time violence surfaced, the losing side was already isolated, exposed, and exhausted. What made this moment unforgettable inside the Mafia wasn't brutality. It was clarity. Everyone saw that power no longer belonged to the loudest or the fastest, but to the one who understood how people behave when certainty is removed. Luciano proved that wars don't need commanders once the conditions are set correctly. Two families prepared for war, believing strength would decide everything. Lucky Luciano decided who would lose first, simply by knowing who couldn't wait. And that lesson endured. In a world built on force, the most dangerous advantage turned out to be patience.